Thank you for hauling all the way out to Georgetown. My name is Gillian Hubner, and I lead the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues here at Georgetown. We were founded in 2021 to ensure that there is a space on campus for dynamic engagement around the most challenging issues facing children and young people worldwide. We didn't, of course, imagine when we began that one of the most challenging issues that we'd face as a community and a sector was the end of U.S. aid and the impact that that's had on all of us, and especially on young people around the world. I wanted to just see who's in the room. How many people consider themselves young people? Okay. Today is Georgetown Day, by the way, which means the entire campus is having a giant party outside, which might impact the number of Georgetown students showing up today. But anyway, there are many other young people at heart, at least in the room. How many people here have been directly impacted by the USAID crush? Yeah. Solidarity with you guys, and thank you for your service. Somebody at Georgetown recently said that Georgetown has become a favorite refugee camp for those who were once, and I think that's true. We actually, I think, were one of the few groups that benefited from the shutdown, only in the sense that we managed to bring some of the greatest people, innovators, onto our team. So I'm delighted to have Sarah Sladen and Mike McCabe, who you all know, as leaders in this field as part of the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues as senior fellows. So it's all thanks to them for organizing this extraordinary opportunity and all the work leading up to it. And Saji Prellis, too. Saji Prellis is also one of our fellows. Yeah. And so we were very fortunate, actually, in the aftermath of the troubles, shall we say, that we received a significant grant from the GHR Foundation to kind of respond rapidly, and part of that was to save resources and learning. So we set up an online hub that has preserved a lot of the documents that many of you were involved in producing over time, so that's accessible to you. The information, the learning, the data is not lost. We're going to keep it until it can go back up somewhere besides Georgetown. And we also brought the former Children in Adversity team from USAID to Georgetown, and the Youth and Development and Peace and Security folks as well. So there's a consolidated effort to learn about those 25, 30 years of U.S. government-led investments in this sector. And we've released some documents on the Children in Adversity portfolio. We're also doing similar work related to the efforts to prevent and end child labor, and the youth and development, of course. So that's just a little bit of framing, a heartfelt welcome. We care about you very much. Really nice to see the reunions happening and the incredible energy that you guys still bring. And we hope that we can breathe some more life your way through this day. I want to invite my colleague, Professor Erwin Tiongson, who leads the Global Human Development Program at the School of Foreign Service, to also share a few words from the university. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian. And good morning, everybody. I'm one of the young ones in this program. That's spelled O-N-C-E, young ones. So good morning and welcome to Georgetown's campus. My name is Erwin Tiongson. I'm director of the Global Human Development Program at the School of Foreign Service. We are privileged to have among our faculty members Gillian and Rebecca. So on behalf of the Global Human Development Program, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you today to the dialogue, Engaging Young People as Partners in Policy and Practice, summary of lessons from 25 years of global youth development. I should acknowledge that this is a terribly difficult time, and the world is confronting complex and interrelated challenges. And if we all aspire, as we do, to create a better world for the next generation, for young people, it is clear that sustainable solutions cannot be designed for young people without being shaped with them. So today is about learning from 25 years, a quarter century of practice, and reimagining the path forward. It is about recognizing young people and how they should be co-creators of the policies and systems that shape their lives. We at GHD, Global Human Development, are especially proud to convene this dialogue in partnership with the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues. I think this is an extraordinary gathering. For years, the Collaborative has served as a vital bridge, connecting research, policy, and practice to advance the well-being of children and youth around the world. And I'm going to add, on a more personal note, that I'm proud to say that I have been collaborating with Gillian and colleagues since the early days of the Collaborative, when I think she had a small office behind the coffee shop of the ICC building. But even then, I knew I had the sense of the transformative work that the Collaborative would do someday soon. So what I have learned from Gillian, from colleagues, from students and alumni of our program is this. Meaningful partnerships between youth and adults require more than invitation. It requires shifting power. Those are also in keeping with the deepest values of my own graduate program, ones that animate our own pedagogy and daily conversations inside and outside the classroom. It requires listening deeply, resourcing participation, and creating systems that value youth expertise alongside traditional forms of knowledge. That is the work ahead of us. So today, I invite all of us, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, faculty members, and young leaders alike, to engage with openness and intention. Thank you, Gillian, Sarah, and Mike, and colleagues for the partnership, and thank you, everybody, for being part of this important conversation, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Erwin, and thank you, Gillian, and thank you to the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues for creating this space. I'm Sarah Sladen. I'm a senior fellow with the Collaborative. I was also the senior agency advisor for youth development at USAID until July of last year. And it is really nice to see you all. For some of us, this is a youth development high school reunion. For others, this is new. I'm most excited to see both old and new faces in this room. I also want to acknowledge we have quite a few students here from, I think, the Global Impact Lab at OAS. We're thrilled that you're here. Thank you for joining us. We know it's not the same as what's happening outside. So why are we here? Let's talk about what we hope to do with today's agenda. Well, the first is we're going to reflect a bit about what's coming out of a working paper that Mike McCabe and I are developing together on lessons over the last 25 years of youth and development at USAID. The second is because we are all in adaptation mode in a variety of ways, we're interested in considering what these lessons can tell us about how to think about the current moment, the present, the future. And the second is that, part of what made youth development happen at USAID was the community that built it and brought it to the agency. So we're committed to field building. That's a big part of the culture of the Collaborative. So we wanted to get you a chance to connect with each other. We know you're here for the free food and to network, so we're going to do that as well. Build your connections, introduce yourself to someone you haven't met before. We have to keep building the community. And then the last is to be informed. And by be informed, I mean we want to learn from you. We are two people trying to write a report about a really big story, and so we know that our lenses and perspectives are limited. We interviewed and talked to a lot of people to try to pull this story together. What we're hoping to do is bring the learning and the conversations and the insights that are generated in our fireside chats and in the World Cafes that happen this afternoon back into the working paper, which we hope to finalize by June of this year. So this will give you a little bit of a sense of the shape of today. We're somewhere around the first two bullets. And so we'll go through some of the learning and insights and recommendations from the report. You'll hear from some really great speakers in our fireside chats. And then the latter half of the agenda is a chance for you all to stop listening and start talking to each other. And so Mike will explain the format when we move to the World Cafe. And then we'll close, and we hope that you stay for some networking and some more free food at the end. So thank you again for being here. And with that, I'm really happy to introduce my colleague, Senior Fellow Mike McCabe, and co-author of this working report, to kick us off and talk a bit about some of the lessons and recommendations that we're seeing.
It's so good to see everybody, and especially see old friends, people who've been part of this, this process over the last 25 years and beyond. And more than anything, thank you to Georgetown University, to Gillian and the Global Collaborative on Children's Issues for creating that space where we could grow and deepen our knowledge about what has happened as deep, durable lessons, and what that path forward is by creating spaces to connect with young leaders, both at Georgetown but across the world. And again, raise your hand if you're from Latin America, all right? Look at this. We should just do this whole program in Spanish, ¿sí? Vamos a empezar a hablar en español y todos los demás tienen que have your interpreters ready. But really, this last year has been so challenging on so many of us because everything we have been working on and building upon the shoulders of those who went before it was really dismantled over the last year. And so how we look at the durable lessons of programs that we worked on and billions of dollars of investment, 86% of all the projects disappeared in overnight. And that meant dozens of youth-related programs. But more than programs lost and budget lost, it was trust that was lost. Trust of our host country national staff, of USAID, of implementing partners, but more importantly of young people who had been part of this capacity building and power shifting process. And so for us right now, this report is more an ongoing conversation about the path forward and using those lessons so that we can partner better moving forward.
So our goal is not to try to tell a comprehensive story of all of USAID, but to try to capture the important moments over the last 25 years that kind of shape the arc and the progress of youth development. And we identified 5 core eras that really helped sort of shape practice, change programming approaches, and inform the kinds of partnerships that we advanced. And so this is a lot on one graphic, but it will be in the report, and we're going to try and sort of show this sort of narrative arc of USAID over time. We also know that, like politics, memory and development can be short. And so the goal is to capture learning and lessons that we can apply forward. And so what do we mean by durable lessons? We're talking about lessons that we saw as high-level and cross-cutting, that were consistent across time and relevant to today. We're looking at both things that represent real progress in youth development, but also places where there are gaps and continued opportunities for investment, for collaboration, for advocacy, for legislation. And we're looking at lessons that could be relevant to multiple audiences and institutions and actors that are really focused on advancing youth well-being, opportunity, and security. And finally, we've organized these lessons into 3 thematic buckets that Mike is going to talk about next.
So as we look at this, and you can see a little bit the different themes that we've tried to pull all the input that we got from young leaders around the world, from youth specialists who are in this room and outside of this room, to say, what were those real themes of durable lessons? And we have to start with sometimes what I would call the cornerstones, the most obvious things that are out there. And that was starting with that belief of the fundamental shift of approach and philosophy. And within that, the hardest part was the most obvious, that youth development is good international development. So many of us have been in this struggle over the years of making sure that the role of young people in contributing to every one of the sectors of development was respected and not just a nice set aside. It was, oh, nice to have that youth participation as a token side of it, but actually looking at the strategic imperative of young people in terms of how they were integrated from the very end of the beginning of the process to the end of the process of design. So when we think about right now the fact that 90% of the world's population by 2050, or about 1.3 billion young people, are in low and middle income countries, what that means is it's really hard to think about global stability when young people are being left completely out of that equation in so many places. And we see the outcome of that in places like Kenya, Nepal, and 70 other countries where youth protests were significant in size according to research in the last 2 years. We also look at the research of Shai Nades from UNICEF, who just put out his report on adolescent youth participation, which found in their research with young people around the world that 94% of young people that participated in youth spaces and community development spaces felt that their participation and voice was not taken seriously at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the process. We've got a number of people from the World Bank here, and I want to shout out the work they did in 2024 on the Youth Empowerment Global Survey, because they look at this important decisive decade discussion about what it meant for exclusion and these overlapping aspects of exclusion there. But why the decisive decade of 15 to 24 is so important, what happens on the upskilling to job space, in development of human relationships and family space, civic engagement space. All of the things that happen in that decisive decade are fundamental for what the outcomes are downstream. The same thing that we talked about at USAID for the past 20 years was about the missing middle. That USAID was doing really great work on early childhood development in health and education. And then we were doing some really interesting economic development projects with adults, but we lost all the return on investment because we stopped the investment on human development across the ages and stages. And that brings us to the second main lesson that was durable lesson, and it's the role of asset-based. So when I got out of Georgetown, I remember in this very room, I went to my career fair on my senior year. I wasn't at Georgetown Day. I was looking for a job here in this very room. But there was a cover of a magazine that came out that year with Time Magazine. It said, "Youth, Super Predators." I don't know if you remember if you're this age, but youth were seen as super predators. And that was the front cover of Time Magazine. They were seen as the risk. There was fear. We had to plug the holes in the boat of young people rather than figure out what their assets were, what their strengths were. And the work of Michelle Cahill and Karen Pittman and Claire back there and so many others who worked to change the awareness of the approach of positive youth development. That became a change across the entire U.S. government. The USG's interagency on working group on youth made positive youth development the approach across all 22 agencies. And that was really important because it changed the way we think about young people and the way we had to think about how we measured it, how we invested in it, and how we designed those projects. And that led to the third key lesson that's a durable lesson, and that was the power of integrated programming or multi-sectoral comprehensive programs. I know that a lot of the people in this room, if we had a conversation after today, we would remember how challenging it was to design multi-sectoral projects across the Bureau of Global Health and Education and Workforce and Democracy, Rights and Governance. But what we did know was that programs like Alcance Positivo in Central America that was trying to work on changing safety of young people and communities through helping them find jobs wasn't just about getting job programs right. It was about the mental health and trauma support that they needed through a number of partners. It was about the faith-based organizations that worked with us on the mentoring side of it. It was looking with the Ministry of Health on how we were looking at wraparound support to both the parents and to youth. So it was getting the various components, and that was hard because what we found is We had to realign the funding that existed. We had to realign the design of the teams that were working. It was really easy to work in our teams within a mission or within a bureau in USAID. It was hard to get those people to design together, and partly by coming up with what we called F indicators, global indicators about youth beneficial outcomes that was linked to positive youth development, it allowed us to design our programs a little bit more in an integrated way. What was the outcome of this? We saw tremendous outcomes that spilled over not only from the youth side, but into each of the sectors and the bureaus that those programs were working in. So we'll transition over to a second kind of bundle of our theme. And that was moving into the part of bringing our policy to life. Those first kind of cornerstones, what they allowed us to do was really prepare for the 2012 Youth and Development Policy. It was the first time that a bilateral agency had put youth at the forefront in its programming. And it took a lot of different efforts to bring the policy to life, but not be just a nice document that sat on the side. And what that took in turn was champions. And so we have Chris Milligan here, who's the senior counselor. There was Don Steinberg, there was Susan Reich. There's so many people, some in this room and some not here today. And they helped us think about these 4 levers that allowed us to take a policy and institutionalize our investment in young people. So what were those? They were demand signals that came from senior leaders, of the senior counselors of the agency, from the heads of the bureaus, the senior champions group on youth. They created the demand signals that then allowed us to work through country strategies. And where we had our most success was working with those teams in each of the countries and having youth advisors in each of the 62 missions that made it an issue to run through each of the programming that we were working on in those countries. And then the last part of that was creating the technical guidance that allowed us to have great success. That gave us an organizational structure that allowed us to move from just simply having policies that exist to actually having the demand signals, the technical guidance, the local champions in each of our offices. And that was transformational on that part.
So another key part of building the scaffolding at USAID was growing the evidence base through investing in research and building better tools to measure. Mike just mentioned the standard F youth indicators. That helped us to count how many youth we were reaching, but it was narrative reporting, it was custom indicators for youth and things like global health and education and economic growth that added to the toolbox. It was also importantly positive youth development research and indicators, because that's what started to help us measure youth outcomes, measuring things like agency and youth contribution. And we also saw over time, it took some time, but we started to see youth participatory research emerge. And that was helping us to better understand young people's actual lived realities while also building skills and roles inside of projects and programs. And so we know that evidence matters, you all know that, but at USAID, youth was a population without an earmark. And so by building evidence, reporting, it helped us to bring visibility to youth and why they were relevant to everything that the agency did across all of our portfolios. And it also, in turn, then helped us to influence the dollars that we didn't have. And so at last reporting in FY23, we were at about $300 million in youth programming if we include PEPFAR. And so when we talk about evidence, it's investing in it, it's gathering it, who leads it, who contributes to it, how it's received. It adds up over time for youth. I've just mentioned youth engagement, and this brings me to the last lesson under this theme. It's been really exciting to see some funders talk more and more about locally led and trust-based approaches and youth-led. I know we have the Global Fund for Children here, and that's exciting. But I think we wanted to talk about youth engagement because trying to advance meaningful and inclusive youth engagement at the world's largest bilateral funder yielded some important lessons. And one of the biggest is that advancing youth engagement meant addressing both the mechanics but also the mindsets of the agency. It's why we developed a new training for staff in youth engagement. It's why we leveraged as much as we could youth programs to pilot, to learn, to test, to build a proof of concept of what was possible in youth engagement. It's why we worked and tried to better connect the dots between localization over here and youth engagement over here. And we were leveraging emerging research that showed that working with youth partners wasn't just the right thing to do, but that it was also cost effective. It had a high social return on investment. And so we were trying to make that pitch. And so I would say USAID did make progress on this, but we also learned how deeply embedded barriers and leadership norms can be. And so understanding, naming, and addressing this persistent lack of trust and perceived credibility of young people inside of ourselves and inside of our institutions was a really important lesson to learn. And so that brings us to our last theme. We are looking at global shocks and stressors, of which there have been a few. And I just talked about trust and credibility. And looking around the world today, it's a big theme. We see that trust in institutions among a lot of people, but young people as well, is a significant stressor. It's also not a new thing. And so in 2012, when the first youth policy was launched, there was this recognition that development and diplomacy and security goals would not hold unless we worked with young people. It's partly why USAID and State Department launched youth leadership networks like YALI, for example. But the first youth policy also emerged in the same era as 9/11 and as the Arab Spring, and there was a lot of anxiety about young people. I think there still is, about how to engage young people and youth movements and networks. And so even at the same time that we were seeing gains in positive youth development and asset-based thinking, we were also seeing that youth could be really quickly pulled from an asset lens back into a threat lens. And I think these tensions and contradictions persist today. And so it's clear then, as it is now, that intergenerational trust, meaning trust between generations, between young people and formal institutions, needs our urgent attention, and it needs new thinking, because it's also clear that youth are not waiting for institutions to catch up to them. Another big shock, no surprise, is digital technology. This has had an outsized impact on young people's development and on development programming, and it's brought out opportunities, access to education, to skilling, to engagement, mobilization. But it's also presented persistent challenges and risks. In 2024, 21% of young people between the ages of 15 and 24 are not on the internet, but we also see enormous gaps in digital literacy, misinformation, bullying, surveillance. All of these are contributing to a compounding youth mental health crisis. And so USAID was responding to these challenges. It promoted digital literacy, it promoted safeguarding, it looked at ways to protect young people from digital harm. But what we also see is that it's clear we were often in reaction mode to technology and its impact on young people. And so with AI, now we're facing an even more complex challenge. But we also have an opportunity, if we choose to do it, that instead of reacting to technology, we can put youth at the center and go from there, including on decisions around policy and governance for a technology that's going to be shaping young people's social and economic futures for many years to come. And finally, just quickly on our last lesson around adaptation and flexibility. I mean, this has always been a need in our programming. It's not necessarily been a feature of it. But when we looked back, when we looked at things like the impact of COVID, for example, or conflict, and in places like Ukraine and in Palestine, a number of youth programs and networks and partners demonstrated resilience and adaptation. And of course, a key factor were the people and the young people inside of those programs. But another contributing factor seems to be that programs that integrated youth engagement from the start and that built in adaptive management were better able to respond and integrate to these changes. And when I say integrate, meaning respond to what they were hearing from young people about their immediate needs. I think this is also an area where, especially since the shutdown, we would benefit from a deeper look. And so if anyone is exploring this particular question about what contributes to organizational resilience and adaptation, we'd love to talk with you. And so finally, almost done, we're turning to recommendations. So we're looking back, we're also looking forward. These are just some of the early recommendations that started to come out of the report in talking to colleagues. People were thinking about the past, but they were also thinking about where do we go from here. And we're going to test some of these going forward. But I wanted just to talk very quickly about the first one. You'll see 3 recommendations here, and they're sort of connected and overlapping because each of them speaks to issues around meeting young people where they are, knocking down barriers, and creating space for safety and leadership. And so when we're talking about, for example, building youth leadership into operations, there is, I think, a real impatience now with moving from intermittent consultation of young people to actually thinking about how you build organizational infrastructure, mechanisms, and budgets to do it in a way that is sustained. This issue on youth networks and ecosystems of support, I think there's an opportunity not just to learn from all of the investments of USG informal youth leadership networks, but to better understand informal networks, the role of youth-led networks, how these contribute to providing safety and support for young people, but also social impact and development. And then this last on inclusive youth development, I think for a lot of people in the room, these feel fairly obvious, but they're not necessarily showing up in an obvious way across development. And so root causes, which showed up in the ways we approached PYD, for example, is really about looking at the multiple drivers of exclusion for young people. If we don't address the root cause, we're kind of swatting at the symptoms inside of our programs. And exclusion also creates an economic cost, and being more explicit about that economic cost for exclusion, what it means for stability, for economic growth. These were all kind of things that our colleagues were saying we need to better communicate about and think about how to integrate beyond just programmatic approaches.
Thanks, Sarah. The second theme or bundle of recommendations that we were hearing from young people and professionals around the world was around systemic and locally led investments. And a recent survey by Humanity United really drove that home when it talked about this decrease in support for youth-led organizations worldwide. 75% of youth-led organizations that were surveyed saw significant decreases in their funding streams, despite the fact that they were all reporting higher increases in their actual work that they were doing. So what that means is we have to look at the evidence out there right now on how we change flexible funding and trust-based philanthropy. We hear a lot about it. Last week at the Global Fund for Children, a number of you were there for a dialogue about how do we change and pivot around how flexible funding is working for youth-led organizations. And honestly, the work of the Global Fund for Children, Restless Development, and others have been doing some really interesting work at direct funding to youth organizations, looking at simpler applications, but also longer timelines for that investment. And then making sure that participatory grant making isn't just a nice term, but that we design that, again, at the beginning in terms of the role of decision making that young people play in that. One of the bright spots that I'm seeing coming out right now, the Youth Empowerment Fund of the Global Youth Mobilization, made up of these 6 massive youth-related organizations, has been moving about $2 million a year, 500 projects of under $5,000 for youth-led organizations anywhere in the world. So last year, they reached about 140 different countries that were young people who said, you know what, we need more than ever access to small capital to start and expand some of the work we're doing and build the capacity of our teams and our networks. So looking at more flexible, and this is what we were doing at USAID with Youth Excel, right toward the end, was seeing how do we move away from just having big projects that were working with large organizations and thinking about what did it look like to do really research-based led projects by youth organizations there. The second component of this and recommendation is what a lot of you are working on, which is the economic priority in the global economy right now as we go from kind of education to employment opportunities. And we could all cite the numbers of 1.2 billion young people entering the job market in the next 10 years, despite the fact that there's only about 400 million formal jobs that will come online. That's a massive gap. But when we think about the political challenges and the impact of AI on global economic trends, it's actually really the demographic trend that worries me most about global economic growth moving forward. So what do we do as we think about programs such as what Accenture Skill to Succeed and Save the Children worked on, where they were working with over 150,000 young people in multiple countries, thinking, how do we design better vocational training into entrepreneurship, into placements, or how do we work, for example, with the EU's new program on the Youth Guarantee that actually works to ensure that within 4 months of those training, we're getting young people placed into jobs that are not only one-time jobs, but training them for the flexible transition that's going on consistently with the new AI economy.
I'll go really quickly because I know we're short on time, but Theme 3 is really stemmed from conversations with colleagues about the need for continued integrated programming. Mike mentioned some of the challenges of doing cross-functional programming, and part of that was this sort of Gordian knot of earmarked funding that we had at USAID. We had to bring teams together and convince them to line up the ways that they report and are accountable, and that took people who were really willing to do it. And so this is kind of related to some of the operationalizing integrated programming and where we can go. And so the first is just, I think a lot of us are familiar with the challenges and failures of, bringing youth in, but not staying accountable, not sharing with them how their information and ideas have been shared, reporting back, setting clear expectations. We've learned a lot. There is more to draw from. And so building on that knowledge, sharing it, making sure that it's being taken up, that was one key theme that emerged. And then the other is around building tools to measure agency. We did make progress at USAID. I think the Positive Youth Development Toolkit was one of my favorite toolkits to train on because it actually, I'm looking at Cassandra, because it really was about measuring outcomes. It's nice to know how many youth showed up, but did they leave feeling a sense of confidence or a sense of connection or self-efficacy? How do you measure that if your program is 2 years long? So building more tools to focus on that. There will be pressure to show scale and reach always because we want to reach more young people, but reach is only as good as results. So let's continue to look at the ways we can strengthen these tools for measuring youth outcomes.
Yeah, and then just the last theme is about planning for disruption. We live in an ever-changing world. It will never move slower than it's moving today. And so when we think about building supportive systems with and for and together with young people, there's two big issues that come to the top of every global survey these days of what young people are thinking about. The first is their own mental well-being. And, if we were to do a survey in this room, it's like, how many of you know someone impacted by mental well-being, mental health issues right now? And what does that mean in terms of how we're mainstreaming this issue into all of the work that has outcomes on any of the work that you do? So we look at right now that 20% of young people, according to the WHO, are struggling with mental health outcomes, with suicide being the third leading cause of death for young people 15 to 29. Those are massive numbers, and yet the investment that's going on in global mental health is incredibly small. So it's siloed, it's not there, and yet some of the research on the return on investment on comprehensive mental health well-being programs is showing $24 to every dollar of investment. That comes out of the WHO. So programs like Grassroots Soccer, Mind Skills program, or some of the other programs that the Grand Challenge Canada called Being Initiative, it's called the Being Initiative, is working on mainstreaming the prevention and promotion right into these programs through sports for development, education, or health programs. And those link right into the other component that feeds off of that, which is, as Sarah was talking about, the impact of digital governance and digital harm. Not only the access side, but how we're building young people's sense of ownership and agency on the process of what's going on moving forward. So there's some people that I know in the room who are doing some amazing new work on thinking about the role that young people play in the new frameworks of digital security, digital literacy, digital entrepreneurship. We hope to explore that with some of the roundtables today, but in our report we talk a lot about what that looks like moving forward, both as a risk, as a potential harm, but more as an opportunity if we do it in a responsible way together between young people and other technologists working in that space. So we wanted to give you a taste of what the report is going to show. We hope to have it out as the final report in June. A lot of what the report and the dialogue that's an ongoing dialogue showed us is that we got a little bit complacent on centralized systems. And that's a big challenge for us. So we saw thousands and thousands of documents and platforms that disappeared overnight. Thank goodness for the work of the DEC, which unfortunately still doesn't have youth as one of the categories, even though it has over 200,000 documents that have been retrieved by people working in the field, but also Georgetown University. We have a collaborative that has built a repository of all the children and youth documents, and if later on you want to go up and see some of those documents, please don't take them with you. You could actually go online and see them, but we have a lot of the documents that were worked on by a number of the people in this room. So our hope is that this report is a part of the dialogue that's going on, but it's a much broader dialogue about the path forward.
Okay. So we're going to stop talking now, and we're going to transition. Thank you so much for your attention and time. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to everybody who contributed to the interviews, the focus groups, the global survey that we sent around, and also just talked with us in conversation about, hey, have you guys thought about this, or have you talked to this person? It's all been incredibly helpful. This feels like a project that's too big for two people. And so, we really appreciate the collaboration and the thinking as we've tried to tell this story. And we hope that if, for the stories we haven't told, that others will pick that up and run forward with it and hopefully do your own reporting as well. So thank you again.
Thanks.
We're going to transition now to our first fireside conversation. And so I'm going to ask that our fireside chat for round one starts making their way to the stage. So Neetha, Abulaji, Rachel, Alejandro. And while I do that, I'm just going to explain a little bit about these firesides. So the first, if you could just leave that up on the stage, thank you. So the first fireside is going to be moderated by the great Kate Dallaire at the New Lines Policy Institute. She also runs the Public Service Podcast. It's really great. You should give it a listen. And this is going to invite perspectives from former USAID staff, implementing partners, and youth participants who have, you know what? We can use hand mics if it's going to take. Why don't we just use hand mics if it's going to take too long?
Well, this guy's switch. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. So this panel is going to bring some of these perspectives from USAID's experience together, and we've asked our speakers to think about kind of one lesson, one reflection, one insight that they're carrying forward with them right now to think about the present moment. And then we're going to shift gears with the second fireside and focus a bit more on youth-led impact for systems transformation. And we are really lucky to have our moderator for that, Neetha Tangarala, who is with the Proteus Fund. There she is. And she was also our agency advisor for youth in the Democracy, Governance, and Human Rights Bureau. And so she brings some really great perspectives to the conversation. And then we have some fantastic speakers joining us in the room and online. And then after each fireside, we're going to try to pause, with the time that we have, to open it up for Q&A. So as you're listening, if you have a question for the group, think about that. We're going to group them in maybe pairs of 2 or 3, and then we'll get moving with the rest of the agenda. How are we doing? All right. Let's welcome our speakers.
I guess you stay here. Oh my God.
If you're still standing in the back and you want to take a seat, come on in and find a spot. There's open spots around these tables here in the front as well.
Okay. Oh, it's working. This is great. This is my first time wired up with a mic, so it's exciting. Okay, so thank you so much for the intros, Sarah. I'm so excited to get this conversation going, and in the process of preparing for this conversation, I had the opportunity to get to know and learn so much from our panelists today, so I think you all will feel the same way. So I will keep intros very brief because you have access to them online, and we don't want to waste time reading their lengthy and super impressive bios, but I will briefly introduce introduce our panelists, and then I'll let you know which question we're going to be talking about and how we're going to approach it as a group. First, we have Obalaji Omitogun, correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. He's a media entrepreneurian, and he worked with the Atlas Core program, Making Sense International, USAID-funded Youth Lead Initiative, and is an expert on global engagement with youth worldwide. Then we have online Alejandro Pfefferbaum, who is a children and youth specialist in community resilience, Colombia, and he worked with USAID's youth resilience activities for 4 years. Rachel Sirkin was with IREX for a long time and is still contracted with IREX, working on USAID-funded Youth Excel, among other things. And then we have Chris Milligan, who's a senior foreign service officer, 30 years with USAID. He forbid me to waste time saying anything more about his background, but you'll learn from him today. So the question that we're here to talk about is what sustains? What are some of the durable lessons that we can take from our experiences working with and through USAID-funded programs to engage youth worldwide? And the way that we decided to approach this was, first we wanted to look at a GLOW. What worked really well? What would we try to replicate in the future? Then a GROW. What's something that we learned the hard way, or an area where we saw an opportunity for improvement? The third piece would be structurally, looking at the systems and structures. What are our reflections there? And those might be positive or negative or somewhere in between. But structurally, what would we do if we were waving a magic wand and designing something new tomorrow? And finally, one concrete recommendation for policymakers. And I know that's tough, but we'll do our best to share one concrete recommendation each. And so I want to give the floor to our speakers and allow them time to kind of move through their thoughts on those issues, and then we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But I would love to ask you, Obalaji, first, if you don't mind, to share with us, and I know you also spoke with a lot of your youth participants to get their reflections as well. So what are your thoughts?
On the GLOW, I would say. Right?
Yes.
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. I see a lot of OGs here in the building, some of my bosses, Cassandra, I see Maria, I see Tiana, and so much more. So anyways, in terms of what glowed, I think for me and my team and the project we worked on, I think the proximity to the communities that we served was actually a very big, fundamental to the work we did. So I'm originally from Nigeria, and having come from a developing country, I saw firsthand some of the needs or the problems that that was on ground. So being on the implementing side, through the Atlas Core program and working with Making Sense International gave me that opportunity to be able to work with young change makers on different issues that they cared about. For example, on health, on entrepreneurship, for example, and so much programming. I think, again, it's that core concept of, how when you experience problems, when you come into positions, you're always wearing this cap of as an entrepreneur or intrapreneur, right? Coming into a space with solutions, ideas to drive solutions and much more. I think again, ultimately, I think that proximity to the problems, and then just coming into the space to implement, what makes sense overall.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so what did you see as some of the things that you've learned from programs that worked really well that you would like to replicate, and also the things that you would like to address or change?
I think giving the youth an opportunity to be at the table was an important component of some of our programming. It allowed them to to share ideas with us. We also listened carefully to some of their feedbacks as well. And in terms of taking their feedback, one thing we heard constantly was the approach to aid, right? So it's like, they don't want to see aid as handouts. Ultimately, they want to see it as, could this be a sort of investment? Could it be a sort of seed towards something that they are building? Because ultimately, once the grants or the initial funding once it's gone, it's hard to actually sustain some of those things. So those are some of the feedback we're hearing from some of these young change makers. We're really thinking how it is being proposed as sort of seed capital or seed investment, so that they can actually do work that is not just cut short after the funding is gone. And then lastly, I would say is on the time of sustainability is also we saw a lot of collaborations between young change makers and local communities, local businesses, for example, just like Mike was saying earlier, being able to partner up to sustain some of those local projects that we're implementing after the funding is gone was a big part as well.
Yeah, I love the point that you made, and I want to make sure that we can get to this briefly without stealing too much time from the other panelists, but you made a point about shifting the conversation from aid to partnership investment.
Yeah.
How do you see that changing a power dynamic?
I think in terms of how some of these programs are often implemented, it is that it's sometimes top-down, and it's hard to, when young change makers have some ideas or implementations, it's either the programs are talking directly to the local council leaders or the county executives, or whatever it is. So it's rather than talking directly to the youth sometimes. So it's always hard to make some of those, to find that middle ground sometimes. I think that's always a big challenge, for example, if a youth in Nigeria, I think one of the conversations I had with her was like, if there was something she could if something we could redo, I think she said more of like, it would be nice to have more direct conversations or direct engagement with some of these implementers or funders than rather going through maybe the local government, because sometimes there's corruption in these countries and it's just hard to really receive some of those funding.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah.
Alejandro, welcome. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. And over to you for your thoughts on lessons learned from your interactions with USAID.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for having me here. When I think what we can learn from our experience at USAID and youth development, I want to start briefly with where I'm speaking from. And I served for 4 years as project management specialist for youth at USAID Colombia. When in that time, I oversaw an activity called Youth Resilience Activity, a $50 million activity, and my role was basically start an interaction of strategy, implementation, monitoring, and partnerships. I work with implementing partners, in this case, ACDI Boca, which made a huge job with local institutions, government, civil society, and specifically youth-led organizations. So my perspectives come from seeing youth programming not only as a technical development effort, but also something that have to operate, adapt, and survive inside a complex institutional and political system. And when I think about what future leaders should consider, I come back just to a concrete idea. What's at stake is not only funding. What's at stake is whether, after a project ends, young people are left with more opportunities, more voice, and especially stronger institutions around it that they had before. One thing that worked well is when you treat not only just an issue, but as a center of a serious development strategy. In Colombia, the youth resilience activity worked because it was not only a small pilot, it was a large-scale effort in places deeply affected by violence, displacement, and limited opportunity for young people. And I was grounded in something very important. USAID and Sarah and Mike and most of the youth champions working in DC, they designed a strong policy effort, a learning agenda. We have clear indicators and continuous adaptations. And the results were there. We engaged about 40,000 youth and families across 30 municipalities. More than 4,000 youth received vocational training, and around 3,000 moving to employment across more than 1,200 companies. And one thing that in that moment was clearly one thing that I want to highlight is that about 2,600 entered to psychosocial support services. And that point really matters to me. Psychosocial support was not an add-on in that activity. It was part of the model. And as I learned, a young person cannot fully benefit for training, work, or civil participation if trauma, fear, or stigma are left under-addressed. And another thing that worked well is that youth were not only beneficiaries, they were also communicators, implementers, civic actors. And youth resilience activity supported youth communication groups, youth-led organization, and young people leading initiative in culture, health, entrepreneurship, human rights, and gender equality. And for me, this is one of the clear lessons. Youth programming works better when young people are not only consulted, but trusted with real roles in shaping and carrying solutions forward. That's my goal.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I love the conclusion that you drew about trust and how much can be learned, especially through the reflections of youth who can feed back into the system and tell us, okay, we can't benefit from these areas of programming if these other basic needs aren't met first. So I think that's an awesome point to take away. Rachel, welcome.
Thanks so much, Kate, and it's great to see everybody. I'm going to tell 3 stories from Youth Excel. When you hear the stories, it might be clear that Sarah and Mike and I worked closely during that time based on some of the learnings they shared. Youth Excel was a global USAID-funded program. We supported over 100 local youth organizations in 28 countries with grants and technical assistance. And we helped them carry out research and then use the data and findings to strengthen their own programming and then also to influence policy locally and nationally and globally. So the first story is a good one. This story is, it was in Western Kenya. We worked with 11 youth-led, small organizations. They were all working on the workforce development system. 2 of them were supporting youth entrepreneurs with disabilities. And one organization found that there was actually county funding available for entrepreneurs, like seed funding. And a huge percentage of that funding was just sitting unused. That's interesting. And then another organization also researching the same issue spoke to young entrepreneurs with disabilities and found that 85% of them did not know that funding was available, right? Just this, of course, right? So that had some maybe easier solutions. What our partners did was they raised awareness. They registered, I think, 500 new micro enterprises. They were invited by the county to serve on the Youth Policy Council. And they registered an organization to provide data services locally that's still in existence. So that was great. And what made that work, right? What made that work is that youth were carrying out the research. They had support from mentors that we provided, local mentors, to help them make sure that their data work was credible. And then we facilitated a platform for them to connect for the first time with the county officials and decision makers. Okay, so what's one? I have so many examples of things that were challenges and that did not work and were massive failures. And okay, so one of them that did in the end work but was just riddled with bureaucratic and esoteric challenges were when we tried to give funding to one of our youth-led partners that was a re-granting partner. So it was like a double intermediary, and now looking at it, why would we think that could work? And it was just riddled start to finish with challenges. And we ended up getting grants to these small youth organizations that would generally never qualify for USAID funding. But the problems that we faced within the system, we couldn't even explain them to our partner. Why would, for $4,000 in the whole USAID ecosystem, why would we need 5 approvals for that grant when the grant was in line with USAID? Right, okay, I'm gonna stop there. The money moved, but it did not go well. And our partner wrote a paper which is available online, and I'd be glad to share the link for that. My third story is about a system challenge, failure, maybe. So I was in Malawi for a PYD training, and we did a visit to a youth-led organization working in a school, literacy to help kids stay in school, right? We had 15 mission staff there, FSNs. Those are the Foreign Service National Staff. And they were great, really, really committed. And they heard this presentation okay, well, we provide literacy training, we help kids stay in school. And they started firing these questions. And you probably know them all, who certified the training? And how were you trained? And how was this program evaluated? And it was quite tense, actually. And the most absurd moment was when one of the young leaders was saying, well, girls drop out of school when they get their period, right? And so sometimes a kid will come to me and say, do you have a sanitary pad? And I pull it out of my purse and give it to them. And one of the USAID staff said, well, has this PAD program been evaluated? And if not, like, you shouldn't be giving the PAD. And like, this leads to my recommendation, because like, you realize in that moment, like how far off the rails the focus of like good use of US taxpayer funds has gone in that moment, right? Like, what do you say to a young person standing in front of you? No, you can't have what's in my bag. And so I think this sort of well-intentioned focus of accountability went so far in one direction that it didn't allow these Foreign Service National USAID staff to see young people in Malawi as their sort of client is the wrong word, but that they were accountable to them just as much as they were accountable to their American leadership. And then it also showed me, again, which we've seen, like how much power hierarchies are baked into all of us, you know, wherever we're from, and how hard it is to overcome those. And so my recommendation is, which we've seen already, right, is that institutions and systems need intergenerational perspectives in their bones. Like, they have to be baked into their bones, but that's not enough. It also requires leadership, and we've heard that too. And the leadership has to be really bold, because we all have these moments of going into our sort of regular norms of, you know, who knows more and who gets to construct knowledge, exactly as we heard, and who's in charge. And I think the difference now is we have the blueprints to make it, to do better. And, you know, thank you to Sarah and Mike for the work you're doing to share those blueprints.
And thank you, Rachel, for the work that you've been doing to help contribute to this body of knowledge. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I first of all want to respond to one of the recommendations that Mike and Sarah shared with us, and it's one that I wholeheartedly endorse, which is the need to, quote, move from siloed to systemic and integrated programming. Why is this so hard? Funding comes per sector. It comes earmarked. It can only be spent on certain sectors like health or education or natural resources. Despite the fact that people don't live in sectors, that's the way the money flows. And then there's a development culture to develop only indicators for that sector, policies only for that sector, monitoring, evaluation, and lessons learned only for that sector. So when you are implementing programs overseas, if you are a USAID mission director, your challenge is to force that integration. The long-term challenge for all of us is to create a financial system that isn't limited by sector, but allows the flexibility. And that would benefit more effective youth programming. Everyone notes that co-creation is the way forward. It's still not a standard discipline in developing programs. There's lip service, oh, this is great, but it needs to be baked into the way we think. That will also affect the power dynamic, of course. And it's not just co-create, it's co-implement, it's co-adaptation, it's co-monitoring evaluation, and it's co-learning. And that is the full suite that we have to take into account and make a standard practice. Finally, I want to address the issue that the development world has changed, the development ecosystem has changed, and we need to change how we communicate about the importance of our work. It's not good enough just to say that youth programming benefits youth overseas. I travel around America talking about American leadership and about the importance of our foreign assistance. So from an American perspective, what I hear from families are, well, if I can't afford health and education for my children, why are we funding it for people outside this country? Shouldn't we invest in our own country? And what I have to tell them is that investing in youth overseas benefits America. It benefits you, the American taxpayer. And I go through multiple examples. If your issue is irregular migration, giving youth opportunities to build their own communities is in your interest. If your interest is combating violent extremism and instability, countries with large populations of unemployed and disenfranchised youth are vulnerable to extremism and instability and conflict. If you want to create jobs in America, we need consumers overseas. 95% of consumers exist outside the United States. Investing in youth entrepreneurial skills, creating consumers, creating businesses, creating people, trading partners and markets is in our national interest. And finally, it's an interest for U.S. global influence. Investing in youth overseas is a tremendous aspect, particularly when that is being challenged. So reframing the justification to go beyond just benefiting others to benefiting ourselves is critically important now. USAID is dismantled. 5,300 programs were eliminated, billions of dollars lost, and we need to explain why that matters. And it's not just USAID. Countries around the world are slashing their development budgets, the UK, Germany, and others. So this is an issue that we need to communicate globally to those audiences. So my recommendation is engage. Engage now. Write to your congressional representative. Tell them the importance of what you do and why it matters to Americans. Engage with your local communities. Engage with church groups. Let people understand that that a stable and prosperous world is in our own national interest. So if we don't engage, then there won't be the support we need for the programming that is so vitally important.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, awesome thoughts. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about nothing about us without us. We hear this, but like when it comes to engaging youth, I think that's important. And you kind of highlighted the fact that, first of all, we are addressing a bigger challenge here with explaining the role of first of all, of diplomacy in national security, and then of development as a tool of diplomacy, and then of youth as an essential partner, co-creators in development, and to really do youth engagement, not talk youth engagement, but do youth engagement requires being really uncomfortable as well, and questioning assumptions and breaking down certain what we call power dynamics and systems, but also just ways of moving through the world and ways of doing things, challenging ourselves. And that's hard, and it's uncomfortable, and I'm heartened by the conversation that we're having. Do we have any time for a Q&A? Okay, great. So how do we want to run this? Should I just call on whomever? I think the rooms might be small enough that we might not even need the mic, but we'll see. Does anyone have a question for our panelists?
You want to take a couple questions?
Yeah. I'd be happy to. Okay.
So I was just wondering, you had talked about how we need more integrated funding. Do I need a mic? Oh, there are many. It is on. Okay. I was just wondering, because you were talking about how we do need these more integrated systems of funding as we look at reshaping the development sector, but then we're also talking about a lack of buy-in that we're seeing right now. Right. So I guess my question would be, when I look at it, I would assume that more integrated systems need even more extensive buy-in than what we had when it was at a high. So do you have recommendations as we are? I know this is the golden question. But as we're looking to rebuild the sector, how you would take those first steps to build that buy-in, especially when you're talking about something more comprehensive.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll take a second, then we'll try to hit both.
My name is Bronson Shepard. I am an economics and international relations student. Not here, though, unfortunately. What I would really appreciate your insight on is, as we look to rebuild the sector, right now it feels like authoritarian, malign influences are outflanking us on the social media, especially like the new media environment side. As we look to rebuild, how can we make sure that we don't get outflanked again like they have been? Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have a thought, Balaji?
Yeah, so I think the importance of reframing this whole development work is actually very important. Instead of development work benefiting other countries, just like Chris said, it actually does benefit America. When you do research programs or implementation programs in other countries, some of these learnings can also be used within American context as well, within our own local communities. Look at DC, for example, the curfew issues, for example. What learnings could also be applied to programming our home to engage young people within our own community? And also to your question on, how can we not get outflanked by new media, for example? I think I think everybody in this digital age, everybody has become a creator, a voice, right? I think it's important that we also own our own spaces. We amplify what we know is correct and is true, and not allowing other people just dictate or just be consumers as well. We need to be vocal, and there's a space of media, local journalism, local voices within this space. I think it's really just important to really think of this ecosystem as the creative sectors, individuals like yourself who have voices, leaders or community change makers overall.
Yeah. Do we have other thoughts, Chris?
Sure. Those are great questions. The question on integrated funding and the tension we have and how to move forward on that, it's a great question. And so there are some basic things that we could start with. We need to restore trust with Congress on the fact that these programs work. Congress earmarks 95% of development funding. And then to actually switch that from one sector to another requires a lengthy process of congressional notifications and justifications and timing. It becomes very bureaucratic. And so if Congress had more trust with every administration and could set up increased flexibilities to allow reprogramming, that would be a great start. Ultimately, it'd be great to redesign the whole system, which has, I think 22 different accounts, of funding accounts. That's a longer term issue. The first thing is restoring trust between our two branches of government and to allow increased flexibility. On the outflanking, that's a great question. I mean, when USAID pulled out of Indonesia, it stopped the scholarship program sending Indonesian students to the United States. Those students are going to China now, right? China recognizes why it's important to invest in youth. They have dramatically increased the number of foreign students. Before COVID, there was 500,000 foreign students studying in China. China gets it, right? So how do you do that? The first is we've walked away. We have left our seat at the table. We shut down our USAID missions. We're reducing our diplomatic presence overseas. China has a more extensive diplomatic presence than the United States. I'm not anti-China. Countries act in their own self-interest, right? Mm-hmm. But the first thing we need to do is to go back and hit those fundamentals. Why does engagement in the world matter? Why does American leadership matter? And because we need to counteract the isolationism that is happening in our own country.
Absolutely. Did you have a thought, Rachel?
I have many
thoughts, I'm sure.
I think you said, Kate, something about the amount of humility it takes to change how we all work, and I have been reflecting on many things, but one is how much the DC community gets in our own way, especially in terms of how we communicate internally and externally. And so I think rebuilding will require the expertise of people who have done the work previously, and it will also require an unbelievable amount of humility from all of us here who have done that work to step away from comfortable patterns, communicate differently, bring new people in, and change how we build a system.
Yeah, absolutely. Alejandro, did you have a thought to add as well?
Sure. Well, it's kind of part of the things that we reflect with colleagues in Colombia when USAID were like stepping away. So especially with youth resilience activity and youth mechanisms in Colombia, I will say that we have strong data. We had policy alignment and we had adaptive management. So one of the hardest lessons that I carry is that results are alone do not protect a program. If impact is not translated into political understanding and public legitimacy, it remains fragile. You can have a strong design, credible evidence, and meaningful local ownership, and still struggle to synthesize the world. So that brings me to a broader reflection. I think international development still struggles not only with funding, but with public relevance and public recognition. Mm-hmm. And that matters in nations, in countries that fund international development and countries that receive that support. In donor countries, there has to be a clear public understanding that this work is not charity at the margins. It reflects common interest and common values, dignity, inclusion, participation, stabilization, and human security. But in countries like Colombia that receive that support, there also has to be public recognition that these investments are not an external favor. At their best, they help strengthen local capacity, local institutions, and real opportunities for young people. And this is especially important. This is especially in countries like Colombia, disproportionately affected by exclusion. So for me, the bigger lesson is commitment to youth has to be grounded in shared common values, but also has to be public legible. People need to understand why this matters, why this serves both local and global interests, and why youth development and violence prevention are not side agendas. They are long-term investment in peace, governance, and social resilience. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I wanted to thank the panelists for joining us and sharing these incredible thoughts today. Thank you, Sarah and Mike, for putting this together and inviting me to be a part of this. It's been an amazing experience, and I'm now left with so many other questions. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really happy to welcome our moderator, Neetha Tangarella, and our other speakers to the stage. And we're gonna go with hand mics for this one to keep it simple. So come on up, speakers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Neetha Tangarella. Wow, it's so hard to do introductions because what year are we in? 2026? What happened last year? I had the distinct honor and privilege of serving the American people as the last class of civil servants. I took the oath 2 weeks before it came down at AID, but I would have been at AID for about 5 years in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Bureau. I would say the proudest moment for me was standing up the largest grant ever to come out of the Bureau, Powered by the People, which resource activists and movements around the world that took deep thinking. I was a fan of moving money effectively, efficiently, thoughtfully, and so it was a great honor. And my husband also worked at AID, and so last year was a lot, but I have thankfully, I was really committed to a journey of learning, and now with the Proteus Fund, which is a donor collaborative model that channels funding to activists and movements here in the U.S. So I'm learning a lot about how philanthropy moves money, and so it's really exciting to be on this panel today, this fireside chat, looking at the way that we should change how we partner amid funding constraints, political uncertainty, broken trust in institutions, and so it's fantastic to engage these fantastic people today. So let's get started. I won't do a deep dive into bios, but just provide you with a little snapshot into our fantastic panelists today. We have Corey here today from the Global Fund for Children. We have Marco from the World Bank, who manages the Youth Summit. We have Daria, hi Daria, who is with the Youth Democracy Network as the manager and founder of that. And we have Shahzad, a human rights activist from Pakistan, who is the director of Chanan Development Association. Thank you to you all for being here today. So let's get right into it. I have 2 questions for our panelists. One for our funders, for you all to tell us a little bit about what has changed in how you think about power, trust, decision-making, and really your advice for other funders in terms of what and where they should be focusing their resources to support youth-led change. And then for our local youth partners or youth-led, youth-serving partners, what's one thing funders are getting right when it comes to supporting youth-led work, and what are we still doing that's wrong? And again, any advice you can give to funders in this moment in terms of where they should be focusing their resources would be most helpful. Just an additional note from my perspective, I think, I struggle to, and I think one of the things we should, personally, I think we should do more of is stop thinking about this in terms of a sector. I think that it became too much sector and bloated and all these people here, especially on the US side, and less about how do we move more money to those who understand their communities. And I would even argue, like, I'm a big fan of co-creation, but again, that somehow puts more agency and power with us. And when I say us, those in Washington or, in sort of the Western spaces versus, no, here's the money, intermediaries who are place-based in the global majority. You tell us how you think this money should move. You tell us how you want to allocate this and move this. And it was really incredible to see what we were able to do with Powered by the People in terms of setting new records and moving money, bringing on new partners who are activist movements, informal, not, your sort of traditional organization with an accounting department. And so we were really experimenting. And so I think, to me, seeing how philanthropy moves in those ways, they're able to because they don't have to report to Congress. I still am a big fan of being accountable to taxpayers, but I think there's a lot of learning that we can engage in as we understand how others are moving money. So with that, let me first turn to Daria, over to you, and then we'll go to Marco.
Of course. Thank you so much, Sita. Good morning from Warsaw, Poland. It's a big pleasure to participate in this meaningful event today. And I have supported and worked with young people for nearly 10 years, starting with National Democratic Institute, European Democracy Youth Network, UN, and other organizations. And I think that one thing that I want to highlight that funders have been getting right, at least in some cases that I saw, is treating youth-led work as a partnership. And not so much as a funding and a funder relationship. And in my experience, specifically as the president of the European Democracy Youth Network around 2022, 2023, when I worked with the USAID and State Department, with NDI and IRI, these were really the moments that genuinely felt collaborative. And really, it makes big difference when funders believe in the mission of the organization that they're funding, that close relationship. Another thing that worked well was really leveraging existing infrastructure, and that means working through regional networks when funders had already those local organizations on the ground, like it was in case with NDI and IRI, so they knew what is really happening on the political landscape in the country, that we're able to connect with civil society and adapt to the funding to the needs that exist on the ground. But on the other side, what I can say, was really maybe not as beneficial is that the resources didn't always go directly, as you mentioned briefly, Nita, to those local or grassroots organizations, especially when it came to covering administrative costs, team development, those core costs. Was really hard to get those for some of the youth organizations when funding was not as flexible. And I saw that firsthand after the start of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine in 2022. And there was a huge mobilization of international actors in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and it was critically important, but not enough was done mapping in terms of investment and thinking how to strengthen those existing local ecosystems. So a lot of funding was deployed really quickly. Of course, there was an urgency, but it was, for example, that UN established a bigger office of UNICEF or International Organization of Migration, and many of those programs were really scaled back as today. So we're left with the question, what really stayed? And perhaps if these investments were done to strengthen those local organizations who were trying to as well address those local needs, maybe some of the capacity still was there. So finally, I want to mention that what I see now is that youth work even among the young people, is still considered as something peripheral and more of a transitional phase before the real policy or politics. I say it's like a kindergarten for politicians. And I think it's a big mistake that youth-led organizations are not less capable, and we need to think about that. They are just responding to the very specific challenges of that generation. And if we're serious about intergenerational fairness, I think funders need to reflect about how they invest. I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Daria. And I just want to also plus one in a very nerdy way, like core operating expenses. Like, oh my gosh, project-based funding, like how we are still doing that is beyond me. And yeah, and in America, there's a precedence for that in philanthropy and other spaces. So thank you for lifting that up, because I think we were getting there finally in the last era in the report. Love the eras. I was in the last era. And we were finally getting there. So thanks for lifting that up. Marco, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Marco. I work at the World Bank. I have two hats. I lead knowledge management and communications in the research side of the bank. So we focus a lot on evidence. It's kind of like translating economic research for people who don't have a PhD in economics. And then my second hat is as manager of the World Bank Youth Summit. I'll talk a bit more about it later. But I've been at the bank for 5 years, so I can't speak to what happened before I got there, but I will say in the past few years, what I've seen at the bank is people in general taking the youth agenda a lot more seriously. There's a youth strategy that has been put together that is being implemented. My colleague Hatem in the room is one of the lead actors behind this, and I encourage everybody to go and ask him questions and connect with him afterwards. But this youth strategy has multiple layers and components to it. The first one is compiling the knowledge generation that has come out of the bank. So I've heard a lot of people talk today about silos. There's a lot of people within the bank who've been working on youth issues from their own vantage point, whether it's a regional perspective or a thematic perspective. And this layer is about consolidating all of this knowledge under one roof so that it's accessible and actionable. The second layer is about operational support. So for departments, for teams who want to engage on those youth-related activities, what's the best way of going about it? And this is kind of like sharing best practices towards this goal. And then the third one is about policy guidance. So kind of connecting all of those dots, taking a bit of a step back and looking at a macro layer, policy guidance both internally within the bank as well as externally for clients, stakeholders, development practitioners, and so on. And to organize all of this as a youth task force, so a lot of people from all over the bank working on those youth issues who convene regularly and work together towards this shared goal. If you follow the bank, you will keep hearing these numbers about 1.2 billion young people coming onto the job market in the next 15 years, 400 million jobs that are waiting for them, and how to close this 800 million gap. Nobody has one answer to this problem. A lot of people are working towards finding those solutions. Realistically, because it will take a combination of solutions, just like everything in development, it's an integrated system. You can't just focus on education or agriculture or transport, etc. You need a bit of everything, and if you have one failure, this is going to be the breaking point that makes everything else collapse. So it's been really interesting to see those integrated efforts come to play, and also inspiring to see what other organizations are doing. I see Matthew from the UN Youth Office. They've done a lot more reflection and action taking when it comes to youth engagement. And so I hope that those movements and efforts continue in that direction.
Thank you for that, Marco. I really appreciate that. Shahzad, over to you.
Thank you, Nita, and thank you everyone for having me. So from our experience working as a grassroots, organization, as an umbrella organization that's supporting a lot of grassroots organizations from across Pakistan. To be honest, especially from, I'm from Pakistan, so in this part of the world, if you talk about whether what donors are doing right, it's really a question to ask ourselves, are they doing something right? But there are a few things, of course, when you talk about it, there are a few things that started to coming into place. For example, one thing that we have especially witnessed that lately has started, and some donors are actually following it, and this is actually supporting a lot of organizations, is basically the providing core support to the organizations. So a lot of the grassroots organizations like, for example, Global Fund for Children, they're really now providing the organizational support. And this core support not only helping the organizations to carry out their missions, but at the same time, this is also helping them to build their institutional development, to strengthen their governance, to also think about issues of safeguarding, for example, which is often neglected, and also thinking beyond this project-based approach, thinking long-term, developing this strategic plan. So I think this is something that that's coming out that people are doing right, and the funders are doing right. But at the same time, we ourselves has faced, that co-creation process. We have been into the co-creation process. I've been hearing in the first fireside as well. Co-creation process is also a great thing that has recently started. People are working together. But what we have experienced with USAID, we have developed this project with Local Works Pakistan for 2 years of co-creation, and it only lasted for 6 months. So, Nita, we echo with you. You took oath. We did the co-creation for 2 years. So we are on the same thing on that. In terms of what could be done better, I think there are few things that we see from our perspective that can really help. For example, one of the big dilemma that we are not able to understand is that why this risk appetite of funders is different when it comes to intermediary organization versus the local organizations or grassroots organization. This risk appetite changes everything. Because when you have more risk appetite, you can give more resources directly to the organization. But when it comes to the local organization or country grassroots organization, the risk appetite is very low. That's why their funding is like peanuts as compared to other development international grants. Another thing that we have also seen is that young people, or especially the young people in youth organizations, they are either treated as part of the problem or as beneficiaries who are taking benefit out of the solutions that is being presented to them. But when it comes to the partnership, these youth organizations are not taken as equal partners. That are actually, that can actually, if they're taken as equal partners, that can, take not only the power, they can share the power, but also the solutions and impact can be enhanced. Lastly, I think you will agree that this whole one thing that can be done better is that instead of going for project-based approach, which is like durations of only 6 months, 8 months, 1 year, I think what we really need to do right now, especially if we're tackling challenges like climate, for example, if we're tackling issues like violent extremism or other such issues, that require a longer-term interventions. So we need to have core support, and also even if it's a project-based support, that project has to be multi-year so that organizations can invest more in themselves. So yeah, I'll just stop here.
No, well said, Shahzad. Yeah, and a big fan of multi-year funding and also +1 on everything you said about how much money seemed to be getting stuck in, at least in the case of on the USAID side, in the U.S. And then by the time it made it to local partners, I mean, listen, I'm here for real talk now. 2026, Nita, is just letting it all out, is just, and I think we were getting there, but I just really want to +1 that, and I think it's an important conversation to continue to have as we talk about the future and how we can do better. Corey, please, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So happy to be here, and especially happy to be sharing this panel with Shahzad, who is with one of Global Fund for Children's very long-term partners from Pakistan. And Global Fund for Children is a public foundation, which means we're a fundraising organization, and we've been around for a little bit more than 30 years supporting community-based organizations that center children and youth in their communities around the world. And with that in mind, a few years ago, when we thought we need to be supporting more youth-led organizations, we thought, well, of course, we have it all figured out. We're the Global Fund for Children, right? No. So we did have to shift a few things. So one of them was how we find organizations, what our decision-making process looks like. So we developed a fund called the Spark Fund, which was a youth-led participatory fund where we recruited young people as decision makers from different regions of the world who developed the strategy for what they wanted to to fund in their region. And we needed to provide them with a lot of kind of background and support and not just throw them into the mix and expect that everything would work well. So there was a lot of learning from that process. We recognized we needed to fund different types of organizations, including unregistered groups, and ultimately funding individuals as well. So we have now funded young people as young as 10 years old, and that has meant internally reframing what the notion of risk means for our internal stakeholders, whether our board or our finance team. And it also doesn't mean just sending money to a 10-year-old. There is a lot of care and wraparound work that needs to happen in those instances with caregivers and families to make sure it's done in a safe and effective way. We also needed to make sure that our processes and what we were doing in addition to funding was applicable to more nascent organizations, was applicable to groups where young people may be working at full-time jobs or students and may not be available during the regular workday. So our team had to adapt sometimes and talk to young people on Saturdays or communicate through WhatsApp or reach out to potential groups through Facebook. And we had to navigate where organizations were not trusting that we were real. Like, who is this, organization that has US roots contacting us through Facebook? This must be a scam. So we had to really adapt our own processes and even look at our recruitment, ultimately not only related to supporting youth-led work, but we shifted much of our work to where almost all of our staff who connects with organizations directly is living and working in the countries where the organizations are located. But we also needed to look at who was on our team and hired some youth development, some youth workers who had that direct experience, as well as people with other kinds of backgrounds. So those are a few things that we've shifted over the last few years internally. And as far as a few of the lessons or recommendations, I'm happy that many of them have already been shared, but I think one of them is really making sure your processes are fit to the organizations that you want to support. So if you want to support youth movements, emerging organizations, making sure that you don't have unrealistic barriers to providing that support. So thresholds for funding that are way too high or processes that are way too complex, that you are accessible and open to adapting in different ways. And that what's also already been well mentioned is funding what organizations only need and not only the programming. I think there's a lot of excitement about the innovation and the energy and enthusiasm that exciting youth-led programming brings to the space, but recognizing that some of the things that were already mentioned by Shehzad, well-being in all of its manifestations, that having staff that actually have some remuneration where you're not only relying on volunteer-led work where that's important, looking at potentially along the lines reserves, looking at funding all of the infrastructure needs that are really the infrastructure of impact. Sometimes they're not as glamorous or as sexy, but they're really critical. And I think being able to reframe how those are not separate. I think the notion of overhead can sometimes be very misleading, so that these are really part of being able to drive that critical impact. And then offering more than money. So I think something that we have focused on at Global Fund for Children is being able to provide additional support, whether it's being a connector, a networker, helping to elevate young people into spaces where their voices make a difference, and look at what their organizational journeys look like and what additional support that we can offer, not that what we think is important, but what they actually need. So offering more than money. And then I think something that's also been acknowledged is the idea of moving beyond integration to spaces where young people are actually leading and shaping what you're trying to do. And one example from the Global Fund for Children is an initiative that has been emerging from our gender justice work in West Africa, where we have created space for what we call the Adolescent Girls Summit. And this is an adolescent focusing on ages 10 to 19, designed and led space for both networking and learning and support among young people, but also a space to share ideas and recommendations with representatives of local government, national government in West Africa, UN agencies, and it is supported by the Global Fund for Children and other partners, but really designed and led by young people. And we just had the third edition of this a couple of weeks ago in Côte d'Ivoire. And I wanted wanted to share the voice of one 14-year-old participant who was part of this design process, because I think she says it really well. She says, "I have never been in a platform where 80% of participants are my peers. In many gatherings, it has been older people leading and making decisions. The feeling of owning the space was extraordinary." So I think looking at all these things, the processes, the genuine integration and leadership, and what additional support we're providing beyond programs, even beyond finance, is really critical to making sure that the trust and belief in young people is actually genuine and backed up by our practices.
Well said. Thank you so much for that, Corey. Thank you so much for that. And I just really wanted to sort of plus one what you said about like our ability to just even create the spaces for convening and that power of convening. And Marco, I was thinking about a conversation you and I had about, I know the focus of this is changing the way we partner, but you had mentioned so critically, we shouldn't also lose the relationships and partnerships and things that we've built over this period, even though we're or we're in this time of uncertainty. And so maybe you can talk a little bit more about that as well in terms of from where you sit, what you've see is really important also in terms of preserving in this period.
I think, this quote-unquote fight for youth engagement, youth advocacy, and so on, I feel like those are values that stay with you throughout your career and throughout your life, right? So beyond the job title and the organization that you work with, there's a million ways that you can be an ally, that you can empower and enable young people to thrive. I think, so maybe just if I can talk a little bit about the Youth Summit. This convening that we have at the bank, it's essentially the flagship vehicle for the bank to engage with young people, for young people to engage with the bank. It has been going on for 12 years now. It's the 13th edition that's coming up this summer. And it's organized by people between 18 to 35-year-olds, internal to the bank, for people in that age range who are external to the bank. And what we see via the organization of this summit is an incredible amount of dynamism, of creativity, of innovation, passion and enthusiasm. Young people are already change makers and leaders. They're not just beneficiaries. And I think we try to showcase the fact that there is a lot of potential for co-creation. It's also multifaceted, so we try to reflect this. We have a pitch competition that caters more towards people who focus on entrepreneurship. We have a hackathon with partners in the tech sector that focus more on people who like to vibe code and kind of focus on AI and innovation and so on. We have regional engagement, so we did a summit in Brazil. We have one in Chile coming up to showcase local perspectives, using AI to cater to deforestation in the Amazon, for example. And then we have the global edition in DC that kind of looks at it on a macro level. This year we're looking at jobs, education and skills, entrepreneurship. So what do young people need to prepare themselves for the current and the coming realities? And what we see is that it's also an intergenerational effort, right? And I see it when I look at the people in the room. They're all ages that are represented, and that's really amazing to see. You can start when you're young, but you can keep those values at the forefront of your mind throughout the rest of your trajectory. I think as long as you keep this as a North Star, you're in a good place.
Absolutely. Well said, Marco. Thank you for that. I wanted to quickly, and then before I turn to Q&A, really pick up on something you said, Shahzad, that really struck me. This notion that, even within civil society, right, there is that struggle of not taking young people seriously within an organization, and the importance of supporting and bolstering, that youth-led leadership within civil society is also important, and also within institutions. I think when I joined AID, I was 35. And, old one may regard, but I'm looking at Rashad in the back. But listen, I feel though that it was important for me to, in my capacity as an agreement officer representative, to figure out how can we change? How can I be a radical institutionalist within, AID? And so I was looking at 2 CFR Part 700. I have a point here. It turns out annual reporting is the minimum, right? Like minimum. And so, yeah, right. I would go around the hallways and be like, why are we doing quarterly reporting, right? And it took, I'd like to think, yes, I gave lots of people headaches, but, you know, I think it's so incredible when you can bring in younger people into institutions and civil society who are willing to sort of, you know, break a few eggs to make omelets. And I mean, you know, the notion that no prior approval was required from USAID for regranting, right? That unlocked so much of how much we could move money out and how we reported and how we could, you know, transform relationships, but still maintain that North Star. And so I just really wanted to share that because here, as I now work in the domestic context, that's already the norm, right? And so it's fascinating to me that, like, sometimes I think no matter where we are in the world or what institution we represent or civic organization or civil society we're with, maybe we're not doing enough to sort of take a moment and look at how others are moving money and how others are doing this work within our own country or in other regions. And so I really wanted to sort of lift that up. Listen, I'm always going to be, you know, diehard about aid and, you know, all of it. I mean, I think to love, right, like in the Baldwin quote, you know, to love one country, your own country is to criticize it, right? And same, I think, within our work to take that hard look. And so I just wanted to try and sort of connect these dots and also really appreciate, Corey, you sharing some great examples of what you all are doing at the fund. And Daria, I'm a huge fan of network-based programs. In fact, I think that's how I got my current job, is I think network-based programming in the early days of the European Youth Democracy Network, or YALI, which I was a part of at IREX, looking at Rachel, and other places I think are great examples of programming. And it also represents organic work, right? Like tapping into something that is happening, and we're just trying to ask if they'll let us join the party, rather than us always having to, you know, create. Let me now turn to the room before I get kicked off stage to see if there are any questions for our fantastic panel.
One here and one here.
Thank you. So Marco introduced me briefly. I'm Hatem. I'm a consultant at the World Bank's Global Department for Social Policy. But also I wear another hat. I'm faculty at American University, and I'm part of a research lab called Ripple. So sorry, I'm abusing the mic for a second, but I'll be quick. A couple of years ago, we were doing research on the mutual aid groups in Sudan, the emergency response rooms. And as we were doing research, we were looking at who was able to work with them, who was able to swim against the tide and be able to work with these groups there, whereas there was a lot of retreat and there was aid retreat, and this was around the time where USAID was also retreating. So it was an interesting project, and it was anonymous, of course, all of the respondents, but one of the respondents mentioned that they couldn't at all, and the way that they were able to in the end is that they had a cash transfer program. They couldn't spend the money from the cash transfer program because the circumstance changed, so they gave $205,000 grants to the ERRs. This is an example of rule breaking, right? This is not an example of institutional change, and I wonder how much of that is needed, because sometimes institutional change is just so hard. It's so hard to swim against the tide. It's so hard to cancel those quarterly reports, right? So what sort of rule breaking do we need to do to be able to really just give people the money, right? And I think sometimes we just need to be willing to do that, because everybody in the room is cognizant that we are so slow, we're so bureaucratic, and I think anybody in the aid world sees that, but very few actually try to change it, right? Okay, I'll stop there, and I realize it's a reflection more than a question. Over here.
Hi, I'm Monica Caminiti from Save the Children. I was wondering if the panel can give us an example in which we were able to elevate the voices of the most marginalized youth. I think it's when we talk about representation of young people, we tend to lean on those youth that in countries they are privileged, you know, they can go to school, they can go to university, but how do we actually get to elevate the voices of those that are not as fortunate? So I wonder if you guys can share some good examples of what works. Thank you.
Great. Let me see if any of our panelists want to jump on either question. Yes, please go ahead, Shazad.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Monica, for asking this question. That makes me, before responding, I just want to share that we are living in a context where if a group of young people wanted to come together and form an organization, it takes them to get a registration certificate, takes them 3 years just to get a registration certificate. Right. And also to open a bank account for that organization, it takes another 2 years. And by that time, another law is required that they need to get registration for another law. So for 7 to 8 years, they need, in order to get a legal identity, just to be present. And in this context, we're working, and this is a 2026, we're not talking about like old ages. So this is a context where young people are still struggling, they're still organizing themselves, a lot of collectives are working together. And one way that we are trying our best to help those collectives and informal, unregistered groups and also registered organization is that we have formed the Youth Resilience Fund. Youth Resilience Fund basically is a local fund that we have developed ourselves. It's being, the entire decision making of that fund is indigenous, which means that we are raising the funds, of course, from international organizations and everywhere else, but we are making the decisions and then we are re-granting those through this Youth Resilience Fund. We are giving small grants to organizations and also to individuals between $5,000 and $20,000, depending upon whether we're giving it to the organizations or individuals or informal groups and collectives. So this is just one way of supporting, because of course we understand that these new emerging organizations or collectives are not able to comply with the regulatory requirements or the donor requirements. So we have taken a lot of responsibility on their behalf to compliance, but at the same time making sure that they, despite of all these challenges, they continue to have the work that's needed in their communities, because they're the ones who are putting their life at risk every day, and they, of course, cannot focus on the compliance in other part of the world. So this is one way of supporting these organizations through the Youth Resilience Fund that we have developed. So I'll not take more time. Of course, other organizations can add. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahzad. Others to the questions?
Sure. One example I can share is related to what I mentioned around this Adolescent Girls Summit that GFC provides space for. Because we're working through local community-based partner organizations that are located, in this case, in West Africa, in rural areas, they're not, the young people they're working with are not the most privileged. They're not located in urban areas. And for the young people that were involved in putting together this summit, traveling to it, they are young people from rural areas who had not traveled, who had not left their country, who had not had passports, who had not had that opportunity to interact with heads of UN agencies, government leaders. So it was specifically targeted at young people that were not the ones who were selected for these opportunities, to be able to give rural young people that space and that credibility even within their own context and community. And it goes much beyond the event. The event is a platform. It's really what happens in between editions of this summit. And what we'd heard from young people between summits were that this experience gave them the confidence to be able to speak to older people in their community, to be able to be taken more seriously. But the real target was those young people who had not had those types of opportunities before.
Thank you so much, Corey. If I could jump in, Hatem, to your question, I think one of the things, it's a tough one, but I think establishing precedence is key. And sometimes I think it means taking the risk and fighting the fight. And I think in doing that, after I had stood up that grant, so many other bureaus and colleagues across the org and missions were coming to me to ask me how to incorporate certain clauses that would allow organizations like Shahzad's, for example, to have an embedded rapid response line within their own budgets that they can determine, for example, or to have certain, oh, that's a clause in reporting, like we only need annual, we can just do a call, great, send it to me. And I think that's often the time is that we're operating in institutions and orgs day by day, and sometimes we just need that bit of one person to try something different and willing to fight the fight to maybe, set us on a new course. I don't know, that's sort of one idea. And then to the question about lifting up, young people that we often don't because, they don't make it into our communications materials, or I don't know, class, that's a big thing, often not included in DEIA discussions. I found that, again, working with intermediaries, so our first line grant makers, for example, Empowered by the People, were all these incredible intersectional feminist grant makers. who are from the region. So that was their office was in the region. They knew their communities, and in channeling that money and channeling different types of support, to your point, both technical, not always financial, they really understood their communities in ways that we all obviously wouldn't from where we sat. But in that, they were able to lift up certain activists who needed the relocation, or certain activists doing incredible work on, girl-child education, et cetera, and they could help us with that permission, or find a way to tell that story without compromising safety and security. But I think, again, it's about the partnerships, unfortunately, being ones that first line, to Shahzad's point, isn't just within your country, but to sort of push a little bit and transform our frontline partners to those who are place-based. I don't know, Daria, Marco, anything else you wanted to jump in on?
I can wrap it up because I see your time's up is flashing. But I would say for both questions, I would answer with decentralization. I talked a little bit about the upcoming summit in Chile. We're working with local actors, universities, etc., to tap into young people, including young people who may not be able to afford to come to those kinds of convenings. So we have some funding to get, indigenous representatives, et cetera, to make sure that we have a broad range of perspectives. And then those perspectives that will be collected will then be turned into strategic recommendations for the bank, for the government. So as you said, I think working with local intermediary and people who are tapped into the reality on the ground is super important. And in terms of breaking the rules, I like the idea of hiring outside, kind of broadening the scope, broadening the aperture, and hiring from people who may not come from traditional backgrounds, traditional schools, etc. And especially if they're young, I find that those types of profiles usually come, challenge the status quo, bring in new ideas, new resources, and that adds a lot of dynamism. I think it's very dangerous when we're all talking to people who look like us, sound like us, come from the same schools, and so on. So just to wrap it up, I think young people should take up space, should speak up. I think older people should make up space and empower and enable whenever possible. And I do think it is a collaborative effort. Everybody should be learning, listening, and co-creating. Thank you.
Yeah, well said. And if I may, I think when I woke up day to day, I always reminded myself that there were people who came well before us who led to transformational change in this country and countries around the world. I'm, the granddaughter of 2 child brides, okay? Like, that wasn't funded by the World Bank or USAID or anything that led to that transformation within the communities in India that ended that practice, right? So we have, I think, again, remaining humble and bringing that humility to this work of development is always key, and recognizing that work has long been done, and what can we do and what can we learn from that as we are channeling resources to support that, I think is always a good reminder. And really, really kudos to Sarah and Mike for the report. I think there's some great learnings in there. Thank you.
Well, I do want to give...
Oh, yes, Daria, please.
Nita, you wrapped up so perfectly. I don't want to disturb anymore, but okay, now I will mention still one point that I want to say about reaching those young people who really need it the most. One of the examples of this at YDN, we co-created with Cornell University an online course on democratic dialogue and civic skills building, specifically in mind with young people who cannot take such courses in person and get such professional certificates. And we offer this, we offered already this to the 60 students across Africa and Latin America. It's online, it's self-paced, can be taken from a phone, in mind with people who don't really have a good connection to internet. So that's one of the ways. And on the breaking the rules, I want to mention as a project manager, mostly on the side of being the recipient of funding, I think if we were to break some funding rules, we would be just blacklisted for any funding in the future. So we really rely on champions like you, Nita, like others in the room, to also fight for us a little bit inside those institutions and those philanthropies. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Daria.
Thank you so much for our fireside panels. They're awesome. Big applause for both our first and our second panel one more time. Thank you, guys. So if you're like me, your brain is exploding with a lot of different things that you've been thinking about. So your brain is awake, but probably your bottom half is asleep. So you're all going to stand up in 1 second. But while you run and get that other coffee or a little bit more sustenance over there, what we're moving towards right now is the World Cafe, where there's a lot of really experienced, smart people in the room, but the smartest person in this room is the room, which is all of you. So what we're asking you to do right now is you're going to hear from 8 different people who are just table captains. They are not here to tell you everything they know about youth development. They're here to facilitate around 8 topics. So I'm going to ask our 8 table captains to stand up really quickly. They're going to tell you what the topic is at their table, and then you're going to move and you're going to fill in, and if that table is full, go find another topic. But after about 20, 25 minutes, you could stay at that topic and keep going on that, or you could be what we call the law of the butterfly. You can fly somewhere else and land on another table and listen in on that dialogue and be part of that. So for the next hour, you have that opportunity to be part of a dialogue going on. I would ask that in addition to the law of the butterfly is the law of being concise. So make sure that your comments are able to make sure that everyone at the table gets to be part of that discussion. So real quickly, I'm going to start. All table captains, stand up real quickly. And so Katie, you want to tell what your topic is?
Sure. Table 1 is advancing this work at home. And how do we build support with and for young people now and in the future across the USG?
Awesome. Yeah.
Table 2 is the power of field building and how do we develop networks and coalitions to advance the work.
Saji.
Hi, Table 3 is supporting youth and community movements, social movements, Gen Z movements, and others.
Excellent. Table 4, let's see, we have Celine and then Corey over at Table 5.
Hello. Table 4 is influencing institutions and systems. How do we build support for youth engagement inside and across our or other key organizations?
Excellent. Corey is up front. So, Corey, you want to mention what your table will be? Right here?
So over there in the middle, Table 5, changing the way we fund, looking at how we make funding for
Let work more effective.
Excellent. Sherry, there you are. You could yell it out.
Sure. My table is about building the evidence. Basically, how do we use, share, grow evidence for youth development?
Excellent. Danielle?
Thanks. Responding to shocks through more supportive ecosystem, how can we better anticipate global shocks and stressors like youth mental health, technology, climate, and conflict that impact young people's pathways?
And
8, overcoming barriers of inclusion for all young people, building a work focused on overcoming barriers to youth access and inclusion. What are some of the pathways forward?
Excellent. All right, ready? Put your hands up. Get the table, make a little drum roll. Get to stand up. People were deep into discussion here. So what we're going to ask is, for each table, if you could hear me, just raise your hands. Everybody raise your hands. It's going to make you, there we go, the blood's flowing. So what we're going to ask is we're going to go each table to give just 2 really top-line things that you heard. It could be a wow or a whoa. Like, wow, that was a really interesting point, or whoa, I'm now really concerned and I'm going to be awake tonight thinking about this. So who wants to speak for Table 1 on advancing this work at home? Katie? Hey, if you don't raise your hand, I go right there.
Yeah. Well, we had a very lively discussion without a lot of consensus, I would say. A lot of, so just as a reminder, advancing the work at home, how do we build support with and for young people now and in the future across the USG? And I think the interesting part of our discussion is stepping back from that. Why are we building support in the USG? The discussion about, do we want to rebuild aid as a version of it currently exists, or do we want to imagine something different? So again, not a lot of consensus, but I would say a lot of talk about locally driven solutions, learning from both from all facets of where young people are supported from our local communities where we live here in the U.S. to our experiences in the countries where we have typically supported young people. And we talked a little bit about also making the case in the USG in America for why youth development is important, and to make it more relevant for making the case. There's a lot of discussion, really, actually, about why should young Americans care about young people in other countries, and how do we kind of elevate that discussion. And again, not a lot of consensus. Would anybody else like to throw in a point, caveat? I lost my train right at the end.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. Something really interesting is I know a lot of people in this room right now, and those who have worked for their last 10, 20, some 30 years on global development, a number of them are working in local development things right here. Katie, Daniela, lots of different people here who have moved over into kind of like either municipal, city, statewide work on that. And it's a really interesting moment because we're learning a lot about things that we've been thinking about in global settings, but now we're seeing what's that crossover of lessons learned. Let me go over to Pia and the power of field building.
All right, so we were exploring the power of field building and how do we meet young people where they are? How do we meet the moment? We maybe had more agreement than table one, and we were a diverse group. Our table included members of Rotary, university students, former Peace Corps, former USAID and World Bank staff, retired State Department staff, members from INGOs, and also domestic NGOs. So we were a diverse bunch. But one thing that I think that we recognized is that civil society is the place where things are happening, and they're still happening. So how do we tap in here in civil society at the local level? How can we be intentional and leverage the resources and spaces that currently exist? What are those? And then another important part of that is how do we make sure that there is access to information, that there are resources? Because sometimes there are barriers to information that supports financial resources or other networks are still existing. We talked a little bit, when we were talking about the local level, we talked about the danger of being isolated and how AI can help this feeling of isolation, even though we feel like we're connected, maybe we're not actually connected. And so how do we help young people and, quite frankly, all people, all humans, feel engaged? So the importance of associations. How do we be a member of a community? And this again goes back to civil society and working at the local level. Alongside this, we talked about civil discourse and the danger of atrophy of human skills. One of us talked about this book, How We Drive, which was a very nice analogy of if we're not driving, we lose some of these skills. And so really thinking about when we're network building, entering at the local level, engaging in civil discourse, agreeing to disagree, practicing the skills of having those political discussions. And then I'll end with one example that someone had shared from a community in Nigeria where there were interfaith members of the communities working together. And the reason they were cited as having made progress is that they came together and said, we have to work together. And I think that's the moment that we're in. And we're all in this room because we know we have to work together.
Fabulous. Thanks.
I somehow got voluntold for this position. Hi, everyone. I think someone wanted to get out of their work. No. Hi, everyone. Jen Horsfall, former USAID or Foreign Service officer, over 15 years of experience. Very proud to see Alejo on the screen today because my most recent post was in USAID Colombia, where I was the director of our migration office, and Alejo is definitely one of the best. I feel awkward right here, so I'm going to go up here just for a second, but I'll be quick. So we had an awesome discussion at this table. No arguments, just lots of sharing about how to support youth and community movements. And we really tried to frame our discussion, as I look at my notes, around 3 different key questions. I'm just going to frame the wows or the statements that way and then the wows and then kind of the woe, my woe anyway, as we were moving forward. a lot of it first was like, what are we learning? What have we learned? What are we learning currently? And really trying to look at youth, maybe not in a new way, but in a new way, in the sense that youth continue to be, as many of us in this room know, active participants in the conversation, and really tapping in, and I love the comment from you from Colombia, yes, I'm biased, tapping into the youth movements in a way that really amplify those voices, really give or empower the young people who often can seem, in certain contexts, emotional in ways that really validate their rage, right? Really validate the feelings that they're having in trying to move, whether it's a youth movement, often outside, and we talked about that too, the institutions, often against those institutions, but really how to, I guess, amplify and empower those youth voices in a meaningful way, right? Not in a patronizing way, which is what we also talked about, but in a way that really is genuine in the interest of whether it's institutions or people or private sector in terms of how to support that. Another key area or question that we talked about was how do we evolve, right? How can we support young people in the world in meaningful ways? It was a really interesting comment, and I can't remember your first name, but, and I'm going to blow this stat, so you say it again, but when she was doing a lot of the research around her youth organization and movement, came to discover that 0.02% of the funding in philanthropic funds goes to youth-led movements. Did I get that right? Awesome. That's crazy sauce. Like, that's crazy I mean, I'm going to fact check you, but oh my gosh, that's a problem, right? Like, we need to get behind that real fast because there's a lot of money floating out there. And I think some of the discussion that we had is that, those young people, we can't really trust them. That's a cute idea, but let's wait a few years until they're serious, right? And then we can get into the policy conversations because this or that is just a one-off. So maybe that was a little bit of my whoa moment too, but I thought that was really interesting. So again, coming at it, someone saying with a little bit of humility, right, in terms of those in power and recognizing those power dynamics. Like, don't just invite them for coffee or to a meeting, like active participants, And again, looking at faces I know, and I'm going to come say hi to some people I just recognized later, but just how we do that in an intentional, meaningful, and honestly a genuine way. And then, can I keep going, Mike? So how to create enabling spaces for youth movements. Again, we talked about that, not to be patronizing, creating more genuine spaces, with the big organizations, and we had reps here from the UN, from UNICEF, like how to merge, and that's not the word you use, Matthew, but how to merge some of these movements. When you're sitting at 30,000 feet looking at all these cool youth movements, some of them come off as, all awesome, right? But duplicative, sometimes redundant. So how do we get them together so that there can be this bigger movement around certain issues, I think is a way that, that we can shift. And then again, and you said it so brilliantly, the normative shift that we need to see in how we, empower youth movements coming forward, but really it's the dichotomy between the institutions, right, that we all hate, no, just kidding, not all of them, but the institutions that are not serving our interests but say they are, and then the youth movements that are a response to that, and how to get that to converge. I think that was kind of the intent. Anyway, the whoa moment I had was when I can't remember now. It was Corey, I think, was saying, gosh, there's just so much crisis everywhere all of the time that for young people, for me too, can I be a young, for me, for my kids even that are not, it's over blankety-blank-whelming to kind of figure out, okay, the world is on fire. What's my role as a young person, as an individual, as a human being in this big space, and just being totally overwhelmed with where to start and how to focus in that energy on one particular issue or one thing. I think that'll keep me up at night. So anyway, that's a little bit, Mike, of the discussion at the table. Yeah.
Excellent. Going from the youth movement to the institutionalization.
Are you guys sure?
There's another table.
Okay. So we had a lot of young students at our table as well. So we were talking about some of the varied dimensions, but I'll start with some, a little bit of a summary. So talking about, building support for youth engagement within organizations, and how that requires, changing the narratives around what that engagement is and the value of that, and also creating accessible, collaborative spaces where youth actually do feel valued and like that they are making a difference. And then we also talked about, having, youth in terms of the young staff in these institutions as well, and the importance of having, mentorship opportunities there and hearing their voice and making them feel involved. But really looking into some of the constraints, I think that was a big part of what we were talking about, and people sharing experiences was, very practical structural constraints, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness that these things are even happening, lack of resources, whether that be time or money or social capital. And I think that was one of the whoa moments for me, at least. I think that what we found really interesting and we're talking about was the story you were sharing about, when you were at the ECOSOC and how this other youth leader was talking about, I had prepared a speech, but then all these people are like wearing these fancy suits, and I feel like I was supposed to be saying other things, and then kind of self-censoring and self-conforming into that idea of what older people or like these like important like diplomats or whatever want to be hearing. And then afterwards, after all of those speeches, you were sharing that they all sounded so repetitive and they just kind of all sounded like each other, which is, such a big problem as well, because then as policymakers or with people within those institutions, you're also not getting a real sense of what people are thinking. It's just kind of what you want to, like what people think that you want to hear, sort of thing. So I found that really interesting, and we were still kind of thinking about how you might go about changing that. But then also another interesting thing that we were talking about was how do we reach young people where they are? Social media is part of that whole the preschool campaign that Mamdani was doing, where they have Cardi B judging the jingle, that they're going to making these things fun and cool and like enjoyable as well, to actually create an incentive structure there. And then also closing the feedback loops between these sorts of engagement strategies to actually build trust and make people feel like it's a good use of their time and actually worth their time. And then another, at least for me, another like whoa in terms, I hadn't really thought about it in this context, but having issue areas that are seen as youth topics and those that are seen as more technical. You were giving the example of, usually youth are involved in discussions about education or skills or, all these things, but they're not brought into conversations about budget allocation. And why is that? Like, that's important as well, especially for young people, like how that budget is allocated is going to affect your future more than for older people, for sure. And it reminded me also of, the gender dimensions of that too, how you have women's issues versus not. But yeah, those are some of my woes, and I've talked for a while, but where is Table 5?
So, okay, yeah, go ahead, Table 5. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, we had an animated discussion with people representing many different backgrounds, which was exciting. And we were talking about really sustainable ways to supporting and funding young people. So a number of topics came up, and one really around the idea of, still there are instances where we're bringing young people into spaces and we're not recognizing the value of their labor. We're expecting them to come and join and do things freely. So that's one thing. And then also making sure that we're not always tapping into the same young people. I think one person referred to it as a cult of young people, where you see kind of a revolving door of the same young people. And I think that was one of the questions that came up during the fireside chat. We were glad to have someone in this group who is a young person who was hired by a funder collaborative to help influence those funders and what and how they fund. So that was exciting to see. And then we talked about how, especially if we're talking about shifting from public funding to private philanthropy, to ensure that we're not just recreating the same systems. And someone talked about the idea of accountability, and now instead of being accountable to a constituents and a population, accountable to one rich guy or one rich person. So how are we making sure when we talk about evidence that we're looking at things that are meaningful? We're not saying evidence isn't important, but we're focused on learning and also acknowledging that some of the things that we want to fund may not yet have evidence. So we have to be open to experimentation and open to failure and learning from that failure as well. And then I think there was something else that was really important, but so yeah, I think those are really some of the main points. If there's anything that anyone wanted to add, you're welcome. Okay.
Thank you so much. So, table number 5.5 was wild card, of which Hatem is here to represent the wild card, because we had a fascinating brief discussion that kind of resonated as I listened to others, which is there's a trend going on globally that we need to be aware of, which is the increased focus on G to G funding. It's happening with the US government through State Department grants. It's happening with the World Bank, where the World Bank used to have a massive unit that worked on civil society. It's happening in a lot of different agencies. So I wanted Hatem to just share a little bit of the concern of what does that mean for crowding out what little investment there is on youth-led organizations if it's not coming through G to G.
Okay, I didn't realize what it meant to be sitting on this table, but I'm happy to share a few thoughts. I think that's a very important point, and it is definitely the trend right now. So it almost feels like today's conversation. I'll actually harken back to a comment made by I forgot his name, Connor. The student who is in international studies and economics. Yes, we are almost, so right now the flavor of the month is exactly that, right? Like how by funding governments, we are also guaranteeing scale. And I was sharing this in private with Michael, but it almost feels like a lot of doubters of civil society right now almost feel vindicated. It's like, we told you so, you should have listened, it's not sustainable, it doesn't work. And right now it's almost like we need to do that narrative building all over. It feels like the 1980s again, right? Where it's like, by the way, civil society matter. And we're starting from that first stage. We're starting from ground zero and trying to make that value proposition. But making that value proposition right now is harder than ever because of what people are right now thinking of, the USAID as failing. But it's not, right? It's not failing. It didn't fail. Well, it had some failures, perhaps, but just using that as an excuse to say, let's give everything to government, right? So trying to speak to that language, and even within the bank, and we're struggling internally, and maybe I'm not going to go into that now because it's not the platform for that, but just thinking of how to speak that language is definitely a challenge that we need to work on. Celine wants to add something. Yeah.
Just on that, because I am in the civil society funding part of the bank, and I won't go into too much of the details like Hatem was saying, but it was formed after the Arab Spring in response to seeing, what happens when you don't actually take citizen grievances into account and when you don't actually have trust. And I feel like it was briefly mentioned in the panels, but I feel like we are kind of approaching something like that again. In history, rhymes, doesn't repeat, etc. But what we're seeing in Bangladesh and Nepal and Kenya with the Gen Z protests as well is really signaling the active role that youth, I think, are taking when it comes to systems where they don't feel represented and where they feel like they're actively being taken advantage of, whether it be corruption or other kinds of problems. And this was something that you also mentioned as well in terms of democratic institutions and how you need to feel represented and like your voice is actually doing something to have that trust. And then I'm going to tie it with one last thing to what Hatem was saying in terms of making these arguments internally. And we really do need to build the evidence case for why these sorts of things matters for the zeitgeist of the moment, which, for the bank right now is jobs, and everything's about jobs and youth employment, etc. And all the bank people here will know that's all we talk about. But, there was a study on how when you increase social trust, that also increases the rates of small and medium-sized enterprise formation. So this is very critical to actually having more jobs and having youth entrepreneurship and having those kind of economic growth indicators that we're reaching for as well. I'll leave it there.
So we were a lean and mean table. We had a great cross-section. I think we had a grad student, congratulations, who's about to finish grad school. A couple of, well done. A couple of practitioners, so it was nice. So we started the conversation, our discussion was about building the evidence, and the practitioners at the table, including myself, kind of came out of the gate saying, well, we have the evidence, but we're not using that evidence. effective. At which point, our great grad student said, well, wait a minute, no, that's not fully accessible to us, like, and especially with the dismantling of the agency and the, the loss of all that great data, that there is a big data gap or evidence gap for the next generation of potential policymakers that don't have access to it. So I think that's a major issue we should all be thinking about. I personally will be thinking more about that. That led us to how we have built the evidence base, but we need to build the campaign now, and that the communications around the great work that's been done hasn't been as effective as the work itself. We talked a little bit about us maybe being in a marketing phase right now, and is that permanent? Is that temporary? Are we going to change the evidence we collect based on the realities of the world we live in now, or are we going to continue to be rigorous in the evidence that we collect? A lot of decision makers are making policy based on social media. So what kind of evidence are we going to be required to collect to influence those policymakers was a big question. We deviated a little bit and started to talk about how we really rethink to what end we're doing what we do, and that a younger generation than myself believes that there's this neo-colonial construct, where all these development agencies are going into countries and kind of self-fulfilling this dependency, and that needs to be broken down. What kind of evidence do you need around that, right? People want to stay in business, you should be out of business. There are some governments, an example was brought about how the Swiss have slowly phased out, there's an exit strategy, whereas unfortunately the dismantling was not an exit strategy. Yes, I want to be cognizant of time, so I'm going to, unless I missed anything, does that cover that group? Okay.
Thank you so much, Sherry. All right, over to table 8 and then 7, then 8. Yep.
Thanks, Mike. So we were responding to shocks through more supportive ecosystems. We all kind of started talking a little bit about how shocks have affected us in this last year, because I think many of us can relate to that, and how it affected our lives. And we talked about how many of us economically, mental health, right? It's really complex, like our question. It's a very loaded question, and I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. But what we did talk about is that a lot of the times the systems are built to be linear, and they're built to be predictable, and lives aren't predictable and they're not linear. And so just thinking about how we can think about how our systems can have more on and off ramps to reflect that life is complicated and it's not one size fits all. We then talked a little bit about how investing in communities, and I've heard it a lot, I feel like that's a trend now, is part of the system, right? Communities and micro communities make up part of the system. And so how can we invest at the community level, which is what a lot of people had said they leaned on when the disruptors came in their life. And so that might be an opportunity for us to look and lean in a little bit more. And then the last piece is how systems don't focus on the whole person. That's also been something I think we talked about, even domestically as we move. Some of us have moved internationally to domestically, and even in the domestic space, the systems do the one thing they're built to do, right? Like I do employment, I do health, and people aren't one thing, right? We're multifaceted. And so how can systems build referral systems and coordinate more to take that burden off the individual and allow for the system to carry more of the burden to make sure that they're supporting us as we move through these disruptors. So that was the last piece. And I will just say, I think Nisha said it earlier about disruptors, and I think it was mentioned here that we're living in a really disruptive time. So it is a time where disruptors can lean in and take advantage of that opportunity. So now's the best time.
Okay. So last table, but the best table, because I have a delegation of youth leaders from Mexico. And so, yes. And we have some presence from Ghana, and we have former USAID, and we also had NGO present. But I want to pass the baton to Sabrina, who's going to tell us what you learned.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sabina from Mexico, from the University Anáhuac Querétaro. So our table was about overcoming barriers of inclusion for all young people. So I'm going to start with the wows, which I will be say, ay Dios mío, because I'm Mexican, and then the wow. So the first three wow, or ay Dios mío, were ageism is a really strong barrier for you to be included in all these spaces. And the second one is gender, of course. And especially, I think I can talk about a little bit more about gender because my context in Mexico, sadly. The third one is how AI is taking jobs. Yesterday, we had a talk with an expert from the UN about how AI is going to take over 40% of jobs. And of course, these are the jobs of young people, and also the most vulnerable group is going to be women. So these three are the, this doesn't allow me to sleep very well. But we were talking about the wows, like how I can sleep at night, at least, like, you know, the pathways to overcome barriers to bridges, because, you know, I think barriers can be, se pueden tirar, you can, you know, disrupt them and become bridges. You can construct bridges. So we were talking about how in the African Union and in Ghana, they have this, the listening sessions about the policies, and they talk with people that are benefit from these policies, and like what you want to improve or how can we help this to be better. And also they have these intergenerational sessions between women that can be a president and a 20-year-old woman that has not a clue about what to do with her life. And she's talking with the president of Ghana, for example, Ethiopia, and she can have a sense of like, oh, I have these opportunities. So we were talking and we were thinking, how can we apply this to Mexico, you know, and Latin America, not only Mexico, well, Latin America and the Caribbean. So applying this can help a lot of women to have these ideas and to become a barrier to a bridge in not only one continent, but, you know, in another one, in America too, because, you know, America, the whole continent. So that's how we can apply. Well, we were talking also like, how can we apply this, but with local institutions that already exist in Mexico. For example, in Querétaro, in Mexico, we have a Secretary of Youth, which it's not like, you know, a lot, but this can be help, so we can transfer these three ay Dios mío to like a bridge, and, you know, have a better connection between, well, to be a connection and not a barrier between older people and young people. So I think that's the woes that can help me to, you know, sleep at night. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, and well done, everybody. That's a lot to pull together, and you did it beautifully. We are a little late, so, and I'm standing between you and free food, so I'm going to keep this really brief. First, I want to issue a warning, or maybe an opportunity. Georgetown Day is in full effect outside, so you might want to look right and left as you leave the building and just keep your arms inside the vehicle at all times. We wanted to keep the youth development piece authentic for you. The second is that we are going to do our best. We have recorded these sessions, and we're going to use that to try to update the report. We heard some things that were in it, and we heard some things that were not, and so that's great. This is why we brought you here. And then the third thing is that thank you for coming out on a Friday and spending so much of your time with us. It's really nice to see new faces, old faces. I was thinking about a quote I saw from Dr. Vivek Murthy that said, community is not a nice to have, it's first aid. And I really feel that today, intellectually, emotionally. I know it's been a crazy time for everybody. So I hope you got a little bit of shot in the arm from that and are feeling a little better. And I hope that you use this next time while we have food here to network and meet new people and build your community. And thank you so much for being part of ours.